just very happy to have Jasmin here this morning join us, and happy to have all the people from Wisconsin and abroad all at the same time. She's willing to do questions throughout, but we might resend that invitation depending on how many questions we get. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today. That's really exciting. It's such a great group, and so I'm really pleased to be able to speak with you. I'm going to talk to you about a project that, in large parts, is still work in progress, and so I really welcome any thoughts or questions or comments you might have, either now during the presentation or afterwards in our chats, or also via email in case you see the recorded version of the talk. And as I just said to Jason, I'm not very familiar with this model of asking questions during the talk, but I'm happy to give it a go so that we can have more a discussion rather than me talking the entire time. And I actually timed it so that we should have plenty of time, even if there are a bunch of questions throughout, so that we won't run over it despite that. So just about me briefly. So I'm a postdoc at Duke University in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, and I'm actually in Durham right now as well. I know a lot of people are in different places, so I'm here in Durham. You can see that because I'm wearing kind of light clothing. It's very nice and warm here in Durham at the moment, so it's a nice place to be during the pandemic. So I'm a developmental psychologist by training, and I'm interested in the factors that influence children's development over time. So that is attainment of children, their social-emotional skills, and I've done quite a bit of research on mental health as well. And of course, one of the most obvious factors in children's lives that contributes to these outcomes is their families. And so a lot of my work focuses on how families influence offspring life outcomes. And studying families is pretty important because we know that family background is strongly associated with how well people do in life. So one way of looking at this is the parent-child correlation for an outcome of interest. And so you can see here this figure from the recent paper by Felix Tropf and Per Engzell on intergenerational mobility. And it shows for different countries and across the years, the correlation between parental years of schooling and child years of schooling, separately for daughters and sons. And as you can see here, even though this correlation has gone down over time, there's still a pretty high correlation between parental and offspring education, particularly in countries like the US, which you can see up here. These intergenerational correlations between specific outcomes reveal only part of the impact of family background. So another measure is the correlation between siblings, because they capture a wider range of family factors. And so you can see here another figure I took from a recent paper, which shows sibling correlations for the same outcomes for educational attainment in this case. And again, for different countries, and you can see the same picture, which is that these correlations are pretty high. And so both of these results support the importance of family background in predicting child outcomes, and also the intergenerational transmission of, in this case, educational attainment. And the previous slide was for educational attainment, but really we see a very similar picture when we look at all kinds of offspring outcomes. So when we look at other aspects of social status, such as income and wealth, but also health, including mental health, which is what I already said. I've done a lot of my research focuses on mental health, and also crime, for example. So we see the same pattern of relatively high intergenerational correlations and high sibling correlations. And importantly, these outcomes are measured after the child has left the home. So family background is associated with outcomes that materialize long after a child has left the home and is no longer under the direct influence of their parents in the home. And so if you want to understand how these effects come about, it's very difficult to ignore genetic influences. So here's this very famous meta-analysis by Polygenic et al. On all twin studies that have ever been published. And a lot of these include very medical outcomes, such as clinical diseases, but they are also a wide range of more social sciencey outcomes, like the ones that I just mentioned in the previous slides. And you can see here across the board, so you don't even need to look at each bar individually, but you can just focus on the red bars and the yellow ones, which are the correlations for genetically identical twins, so monozygotic twins, and genetically less identical twins, dizygotic twins. And you can see that the correlations for the monozygotic twins are always larger than the correlations for the dizygotic twins, which indicates that there are genetic influences on all of these outcomes. And that's not to say that environments don't matter. So environments are obviously really important too for all of these outcomes, and especially for some of these more social sciencey outcomes, we have contributions of the shared environment as well. But it just goes to show that genetic influences are important to study when trying to understand family influences on children. And that's, of course, nothing new to you. This is the work that you're all doing, but just to put this in context. And then here we have the more recent data from the GWAS studies. Again, I'm not going to talk about this much because you know this work so well, and a lot of you have led and contributed to this work. But we see the same finding that we just saw in the twin study. So genetics matter for these outcomes, in this case, educational attainment. But we also know that the paths of how genetic effects come to influence offspring outcomes is really not straightforward. And this is partly because of this phenomenon of gene-environment correlation, which implies that the genes that a person carries are correlated with the environments that they experience. And this is an observation that was described to a wider audience decades ago in this famous behavior genetics paper. And it was demonstrated more recently as well, very elegantly with molecular genetic data. And so what this 1970 paper described are findings from twin and adoption studies, which had shown that the environments that children are surrounded by as they grow up and grow old are associated with their own and their parents' genetics. So a very famous example is book reading. So a parent might have genes that make them more likely to read to their kids. And the parents will pass on these genes to their kids. And so the children are more likely to perhaps enjoy reading themselves, which will probably have implications for their, in this case, educational attainment or other outcomes. And so the parent might influence the child via genetic transmission of these genes, and also via this more indirect pathway where the parent's genetics influence the parental behavior. And this path has been termed genetic nurture. And then we also have this diagonal path where children's genetics might influence the environments that they evoke or that they select. So a good example here, again, for book reading would be that a child that enjoys reading more might evoke a response of the parents, who then read more to the child as a response to the children's genetically influenced behavior. So, and again, then the reading might have an influence on their educational attainment. So and this has been termed evocative gene-environment correlation. And as children grow older, they might also select environments that are associated with their genetic dispositions, and then it would become what is termed active gene-environment correlation. And so the general message here is that genes can act outside the skin by influencing the environments that we ourselves experience and that are provided to us by others. And so there were three aspects of this topic that we wanted to address with the work that I'm going to present to you today. So the first is about what sorts of parental behaviors genes are associated with that could potentially influence children's life outcomes. And there has been quite a bit of work on this, looking at parental behaviors, but predominantly in childhood, because when people think of parenting, they often think of parenting during this red period here, so between 1 and 11 years, and perhaps adolescence as well, but sort of a relatively more limited period, whereas we wanted to take more of a life course perspective and look at parental investment and parental behavior from when a child is conceived to when the child is an adult. And so what we did was we divided offspring development into developmental phases that you can see here. And then for each phase, we looked at forms of parental behavior or investment for which there's good evidence that they are important for children's life outcomes. And I'll show you in a minute what these are. And then the second aspect is about child effects, or how children themselves may shape the environments that they grow up in. So this is what I just showed you in the previous slide as this diagonal path. And then third, we wanted to zoom in a bit more into the role of fathers. So people are really interested, or have been really interested, in how fathers contribute to their children's development, and whether their investment differs from that of mothers. And we wondered if we can leverage this genetically sensitive design to get at this question. And so what we did was we put together multiple data sets as part of what we call the parent collaboration. And you can see here that we tried really hard to make this work. So parent is for probing associations between rearing environment and genes across time. Yeah, as part of your comments, if you have any suggestions of how this could be a bit more intuitive, then we welcome that. But yeah, so for now we call it this. And this is basically a combination of data sets that have collected very rich data on parental behavior, as well as genetic data on at least one parent. And so these are the criteria that we use to select which data sets we would want to include here. And so we wanted to have parenting data for at least one of the developmental phases that I showed you previously. We wanted to have genetic data for at least one parent, ideally two, and we wanted to have a sample size of at least 250, because we expected that. So for a lot of the effects that we expected, we would need larger sample sizes, but for the largest effects, we calculated that 250 would be just about enough. And so these are the data sets that are included. And for some of these, we have only just received the data. So the Millennium Cohort Study sent us the data like last week, basically. And so, so the results that I will present to you do not yet include all of this data. So it's going to be a snapshot of what we have so far, what we have been able to analyze so far. But this is what we generally have included as part of this collaboration as data sets. So we have these large British cohort studies, such as the Alsbach study and the Millennium Cohort Study. We have two cohorts that we already have in-house because my mentors are the PIs of those studies. So that's the ERIS study, a British twin study, and the Dunedin study. So that's based in New Zealand. We have the Quebec twin study that has recently genotyped parents and actually now also has data on fathers. So this is still missing here, but we basically, in the QTS, we have genetic data on fathers, mothers, and twins. And then we also include the HRS and the WLS to get at parental behavior toward adult children. And so these are the measures that we focused on for now. So these are, so we identified these by basically doing a literature review and looking at which parental behaviors are the most consistently associated and potentially causally linked as well. So evidence from experiments or quasi-experimental studies to child health, wealth, and well-being, basically. So we tried to cast a broad net, but we had a particular eye on child social status. And so during the prenatal period, we looked at cigarette smoking and heavy drinking. We then looked at breastfeeding during infancy. During childhood, we have these 4 measures of cognitive stimulation, chaos in the home, health parenting, and for Alsbach, and actually eventually for the Millennium Cohort Study as well, we have interest and involvement in children's schooling. And then in adolescence, we have parental monitoring. And then in adulthood, we focused on 3 measures of parental support, which are intentions to leave an inheritance, providing financial support to adult children, and providing help with childcare. And this is to be expanded, but this is what we focus on for now and what I'll focus on for this talk. And then our measure of genetics. So for now, we focused on just the polygenic score for educational attainment. We felt that that was the best measure to get at attainment across the life course in offspring, of course, but also other outcomes. So we know that parental education is associated with differences in offspring health as well, and well-being. And so we figured that this would be a good start to look at the polygenic score for educational attainment first. And so yeah, we basically wanted to see what it might be that coming from a high versus lower educational parental background makes such a difference. And but we do have the genetic data, so in principle we could also construct other scores. So that is a possibility, and and again we welcome comments and thoughts here, but this is what we're going with for now. And then for now, we constructed these scores individually for each family member that we have, but we do have trios in some of these samples. So we will be able to construct this design of transmitted and non-transmitted allele scores, but we haven't done this yet. It's actually a little bit tricky as well, because for example, in Alsbach, where we were hoping for a pretty large number of fathers, the numbers are actually a little lower than we expected. So Alsbach has around 2,000 fathers, which is still impressive, but at the same time, it is a lot less than the data that they have on the mothers and the children, which is around 5,000, or if you look at each of them individually, 7,000. And I'll show you a little bit about sort of selection effects in fathers later as well. Okay, and so then I'm going to go through the results now, and again, interrupt me at any time, or save the questions for later. That's up to you. And a lot of these are sort of like very similar, so I hope it won't get boring because you see these lines all pointing in the same direction. But we'll see. The findings weren't consistent for every single outcome, so there's a little bit of variation as well. So first we looked at the prenatal behaviors. So we looked at prenatal smoking and heavy drinking. We looked at heavy drinking because it is actually fairly surprisingly normative for women to drink just a little bit during pregnancy. So there's a lot of phenotypic research showing that it is, especially in European countries, it is quite common for women to have just maybe a glass of wine per week. And so what we categorized here as heavy drinking was if women said that they consistently drank around 4 units of alcohol in one sitting. So that has sometimes referred to as binge drinking. We call it heavy drinking here. And so starting with the smoking, so this was whether they smoked at all. So whereas with the drinking, we set sort of a higher criterion for smoking, also because of the evidence that even just a little bit of smoking is associated with worse outcomes in children. We really used a strict criterion here of any smoking. So if they had ever smoked during pregnancy, and this is particularly in the second and third trimester, because in the first trimester, women might not necessarily know that they're pregnant. So if they had been smoking in the second or the third trimester, we categorize them as smokers. And as you can see here, there are associations pretty consistently across the 2 cohorts where we have been able to look at this so far, where for smoking, we find that mothers with higher education polygenic scores were less likely to smoke during pregnancy. And then for drinking, the results are less consistent across the 2 cohorts. So for Alsbach, we see an association here going in the same direction. So mothers with higher education polygenic scores reported that they were less likely to engage in heavy drinking. But for ERIS, we basically have a flat line here. So there was no finding there. And then we looked at infancy. So there we focused on breastfeeding. And this was, so the way we measured this is whether they had ever attempted to breastfeed. So we could, in theory, look at more detailed measures here, for example, how long they had breastfed their children. But for now, we opted to just go with a very simple measure of whether they had ever breastfed their kids. And you might, when you look at the proportions here, you might be surprised to see that the prevalences are so different. So in ERISC, basically half of the sample had never breastfed their kids. And just bear in mind that ERISC is a twin sample. And so in twins, it is a lot harder to breastfeed, and the uptake of breastfeeding is a lot lower in twins. And so we're pretty sure that this would explain the differences here. So it's very common to see lower rates of breastfeeding in twins. But even for Alsbach, you might wonder that you might see this 25% and think that's quite high for people who have never breastfed their kids. But the UK actually, just an interesting fact here, is an outlier in breastfeeding in terms of very low breastfeeding or low compared to other countries. breastfeeding of their kids. So it's a quite interesting context to look at breastfeeding. But across the two cohorts, again, we find a pretty consistent result, which is that mothers with higher education polygenic scores were more likely to have breastfed their children. And then in childhood, we looked at cognitively stimulating parenting, and we measured that in slightly different ways across the three cohorts where we were able to look at that. So that's ERISC, ALSBAC, and Dunedin. So in ERISC, we had maternal reports of activities that they did with their children. That includes activities such as going to the museum or going to the library. And then we also had the interviewers who did the assessments with the families, rate the homes of the families, for example, in terms of whether the children had books at home. In ALSBAC, we used maternal reports, and we picked three items that were consistently asked across the years, and for which, that are very consistently used in the previous literature as well to assess cognitively stimulating parenting. And those are whether the mother takes their child to the library, what the number of books is that the child has in the home, and whether the mother reads to the child. And then in Dunedin, we had videotaped observations of parent-child dyads. So the parent and the child interacted in a teaching task, and this could be fathers here as well. So that's why I say parents. So it could be either the mother or the father. And observers coded to what extent the parent gave cognitively stimulating support during this task. And then we also had interviewer observations of the home, again, similar to what I already mentioned we had in ERISC. And you can see here that these associations were very consistent across these three slightly different ways of assessing cognitively stimulating parenting, so that parents with higher education polygenic scores, so in ERISC and ALSBAC, those would be the mothers, and in Dunedin, this would also include fathers, are providing more cognitively stimulating parenting to their kids. And then we looked at an outcome that you might not be as familiar with because it's sort of, I guess, oh, yeah. What do? I see that Jason raised his hand.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you while you're talking, but because we're seeing these figures, I wanted to maybe ask your views on producing these figures compared to a set of figures where the x-axis is just parental educational attainment phenotype rather than genotype. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, so we would expect to see some larger associations. So we know that phenotypic education is associated very strongly with the quality of parenting that parents provide. So I have an extra slide later on where I can talk a little bit more about what happens when we include parental education in these associations, because at the moment these are not adjusted for phenotypic education of the parent. I mean, I can already tell you now, actually, but for cognitively stimulating parenting, we see that when we control for parental education, these associations go down quite a bit. They reduce by about half. So and they're small to begin with, so they're around like 0.2, varying around 0.2, and so they reduce to about 0.1. Yeah, so it's hard to make sense of that, and I wonder if I should bring this up now or maybe wait until later. But so maybe I'll just talk about this briefly now. So there are two interesting questions, I think. One is if you're interested in the genetic contributions to an outcome like educational attainment, and you want to control for environments that might have this genetic nurture effect on the outcome that you're interested in, and you don't have detailed data on, you basically can't control much for parental genetics, but you do have data on parental education, which people commonly have, right? People often have data on parental education. So one question is it enough to just control for parental education to get rid of these other parental environments that might shape the outcome that you're interested in? And the answer to that is you get rid of a lot, basically. So as I said, these associations reduce by half. And in previous work in e-risk, we find that the genetic nurture effect is mostly goes away when we control for parental education in addition to cognitively stimulating parenting. So parental education is a really good measure to just sort of like try and get rid of these associations. But I think a second question is, so what does that actually mean, you know? So because what is happening? It could be that the parental education polygenic score is associated with these early childhood skills and like self-control and IQ, and that makes people better parents, and it also makes them go further in their education. It could be that parenting mediates the effects of education on child outcomes. So it's sort of a lot harder to make sense of the underlying meaning of what's happening here when we control for education. And you know, again, this is something that might be interesting to discuss later on, and think about a little bit more. Yeah, but that's basically a very long-winded answer to your question, which was about the phenotypic associations. And yes, we would see them, and they're pretty large. So just
I'll bring this up. I'll bring this up later because it's more of a discussion in that you brought up evocative gene environment correlations also, and that's not ruled out here too for biological children. This is also on the x-axis. This is partly the child's
exactly
phenotype, as you well know. So I'll save that for maybe later, but I just wanted to say that Philip also raised this interest, this, what you were saying is how interesting it is that across cohorts, these results are so similar in a lot of these cases also.
Yeah, and I will speak to the, I will show you later a few slides where we look at the child polygenic score as well. So yeah. And then we looked at household chaos, and as I already said, that might be a measure that some of you might not be as familiar with because that is sort of a very developmental psychology measure. And so this is indicated by or it relates to noise in the home, crowding in the home, whether there are regular routines of the household members. So for example, an item to assess household chaos would be, I can't hear myself think in our home, we're always late to things, so it's sort of disorganization in the home. And I recoded this here, I reverse coded here, so it's low household chaos. And you can see here again, so this was actually assessed in a more similar way across the two cohorts, e-risk and ALSPAC. So in e-risk, we had maternal and child reports of noise, crowding, and the regularity of routines. And we also had interviewer reports. So again, observations of the interviewers when they came into the home. And then in ALSPAC, we had maternal reports of crowding and regular routines. And again, you can see here very consistently across the two cohorts that there is an association whereby parents with higher education polygenic scores raise their kids in less chaotic households. And what I should say about chaos as well is that it's very interesting because it is very consistently and highly associated with children's outcomes and very like a whole bunch of outcomes as well. So educational attainment, antisocial behavior, health outcomes. So and then people. So there has been some work to try and understand what it exactly assesses. So whether this is sort of something about. So it is, for example, associated with parental mental health. So parents with more mental health problems have more chaotic households. So that could be one of the reasons why it is so powerful as a predictor of child outcomes, just on a phenotypic level now. Poverty is an obvious factor here as well. But yeah, so just for your interest, there's this measure of chaos that is a really powerful measure, at least within developmental psychology. As I said, I don't think it has sort of had as far a reach as other measures. And then we looked at an interesting measure, which is health parenting. And this captures parents' attempt to instill healthy habits in their children. And so again, we had pretty similar reports about this in ERISC and in ALSPAC, the two studies where we have been able to look at this. And actually, for all of these, we will have the data in the Millennium Cohort study as well, but we haven't analyzed them yet. So, but eventually we'll have that extra cohort here to capture these aspects of parental behavior. And so this is about how regularly the child brushes teeth, how much TV the child watches, and to what extent the children eat healthy versus processed foods. So healthy foods would be fruits and vegetables, processed foods would be takeout foods, for example. And again, we see here pretty consistent associations that mirror what we found in the previous slides already. And then we had an interesting one for ALSPAC. So that's the interest and involvement in children's schooling. And so, so when we first looked at just the interest in children's schooling, which was repeatedly asked of mothers across the years, you can see that there's basically no variation in this item. So it's interesting. So I thought it might be interesting for you to know that when asking mothers whether they're interested in what the child does at school, basically every mother will say yes. And of course, because of that, it doesn't really make sense to look at associations here. So I just put this here, just so that you can see what it looks like descriptively. But yeah, so that is an item that does not differentiate well between people. But where we do see differences are when mothers were asked about the aspirations for their child's schooling. So what do they hope, what sort of education do they hope that their child will achieve or will have? And that is a scale that ranged from, I hope that my child will leave school and get a job right away, to I hope that my child will complete a university education. And here you can see that mothers with higher education polygenic scores had higher aspirations for their children's education. And then this last one is about involvement in children's education. And that was asked of mothers, children, and teachers. This was assessed using items about the provision of learning materials, but also the learning support or like help with schoolwork, for example. And not all of these items are necessarily positive. So for example, children were asked whether the parents put pressure on them to do well in school. And we found that actually was an item. So when we looked at this, we found that, parents with higher education polygenic scores, their children say that their parents put more pressure on them. So it's not necessarily always positive. There's also sort of a bit of, pushing the kids. And again, you can see here that mothers with higher or parents with higher education polygenic scores, the children, the teachers of the children, and the parents themselves said that they do more to or are more involved in the children's education. Sorry for the noise in the background. We actually have a train that is really loud, so I'm hoping that it won't come by for a while. If it does, we have to just pause for a little bit to not blast you with those loud horns. All right, and then in adolescence, we looked at parental monitoring. And some of you might remember that there used to be this public service announcement on American TV every night at 10 p.m. where parents were asked whether they know where their children are. And so this is based on this assumption that it's very important for parents to know and to monitor what their children are doing, so their children's activities and whereabouts. This is kind of an interesting construct because the evidence is actually surprisingly unconclusive here, because so interventions that make parents monitor their kids more have small associations with children's educational outcomes and also delinquency, for example. But what you actually see as well is that that a lot of this is child. So in observational studies where you don't do a manipulation of parental monitoring, you see that a lot of the association between parental monitoring and children's outcomes is actually driven by the child. So that children who exhibit more problematic behavior share less with their parents. And they're less likely to follow the rules that their parents makes for them. And so this was an interesting one for looking at child effects as well. And the way that we assessed it was by asking, so in eRisk, we ask mothers and their children. And it's interesting because when you ask mothers whether they know and monitor their children's activities and whereabouts, they all say, you know, that a lot of them, there's a skew in that a lot of them say, yes, I know a lot about what my child does. I set rules about what the child will do. But when you ask the children, they actually say that their parent doesn't know all that much about them. So there's this disparity between who you ask. So if you have adolescent children, just FYI, yeah, so it's just sort of an interesting mismatch between what the parents and the children say. But the associations were very similar for the two of them, and I put them together here in this figure. And in Alsberg, we actually only had the maternal reports. Oh, actually, no, apologies. In Alsberg, we also had maternal and children reports. And you can see here that in eRisk, there is a bit of an association here, but in Alsberg, there's basically a flat line. So there was no really an association between parents' education polygenic score and parental monitoring. And so then we looked at adulthood. And so you might wonder why we would look at that. So, you know, why would we study parental behavior toward adult offspring? And so there are three reasons for we thought this would be interesting. So the first is that it's actually very common for parents to provide supports to their adult offspring. So this is from the Pew Research Center that is a questionnaire that was asked to adults to what extent they provide different supports to their adult offspring. And these could be supports such as providing help with errands, housework, or home repairs, providing financial support, or providing help with childcare. And you can see here across those three countries, Italy, Germany, and the US, that it is very common for parents to provide these kinds of supports. And in fact, for some of them, it is much more common to provide them versus not provide them. And then second, so another reason why this might be interesting, or there might be something, is because adults today reach traditional adult milestones much later than adults of the past. So this here shows you data from of whether 30-year-olds have reached milestones that are traditionally associated with being an adult. So living on their own, having ever married, living with a child, and owning a home. And you can see here the percentages for 1975. And I thought it could be fun to do a little guessing game to see what you thought of what the corresponding percentage is in 2015. So I thought, yeah, maybe this would be like a fun little quiz to go through. So, so what are your guesses for the first one? So how many 30-year-olds you think lived on their own in 2015? And this is for the US. So, yeah. You can, so there are people in the chat, but you can, oh, okay. Okay, that's interesting. So people say 70%, 80%, 40%. So let's see what it is. So it's 70%. So Catherine Schaumburg, or Katharina Schaumburg, was right. So well done. Oh, and Jason too. Great. Yeah, so you guessed pretty well here. And then the second one is having ever married. What do you think about that one? Let me see if I... Okay. So 57%. Sorry, I was a bit fast here revealing it. But yeah, again, we have a bunch of people who are pretty much on the right number here. So it's 57%. And, you know, you can always say as well that by 2020, these will have changed again. And especially during the pandemic, there's lots of data showing that a lot of young adults have moved back in with their parents. So, you know, that's always, you can tell yourself that as well if you're off in any of these percentages. And then the third one is living with a child. What do you think of that? Okay. Oh, it's so interesting to see how these estimates vary so much. So that's 47%. So yep, that's actually, yeah, I would have estimated it to be lower actually. And And then the last one, owning a home. Okay. All right. So yeah, interesting. I'm curious whether, more junior people have different estimates. So 33%. So this was actually larger than what I expected. But I'm also from Germany, where owning a home is generally not very common. So so as you can see here, all of these percentages are lower than they were in 1975. And there are a lot of reasons for that, demographic changes, and it's just so much harder to own a home these days. But basically what this could mean is that young adults are dependent on their parental support for longer. Yep. And then the third reason for looking at parental behavior in adulthood, sorry, I got the chat open here, haven't I? Let me just, okay. And then the third reason was that financial transfers of parents play a role, or play a potential role in transmitting wealth between the generations. So you can see here in this slide that the bulk of intergenerational monetary transfers are flowing to families that already have substantial resources in terms of they're already high in their income and they're already high in their wealth. And these people then receive monetary support from the parents or inheritances. So this is, I think, really important. And so we looked at different forms of adult supports in the HRS and the WLS. So we have one measure of leaving an inheritance that was asked pretty straightforward in the HRS, where respondents were asked whether they or their partner, so what the chance was that they would leave an inheritance of $10,000 or more, and actually different sums of money were asked, but the results are very similar across all of them. So I'm just going to go with this first item, and the results that I'll show you are very similar for the other larger sums of money as well. And so that was a scale from 0 to 100, where they basically indicated what the chance of that happening was. And then in the WLS is a lot more tricky. So, and this might be, so we were sort of unsure whether even to use this item. So basically what happened is that the individuals were asked if they were to die tomorrow, who would get their assets? And then most of them said their spouse. And then there was another question, which was, well, if it wouldn't be your spouse, who would it be? And then they were able to write in who it would be. And we coded as one everybody who said that it would be their biological children. And so, it's really tricky because it's sort of, it's this weird step question. And so, so that's something to bear in mind here. And then we had financial support that was assessed much more uniformly in both cohorts. So basically the respondents were asked whether they gave financial supports of varying sum, but 500 in the HRS and 1,000 in the WLS to their children or grandchildren, could include grandchildren as well. And then we had childcare help, and this was whether the respondents had helped their kids, their adult children, with taking care of their grandchildren, or by one generation. So if they had helped take care of their great grandchildren. And so just walking you through this, sorry, this is not as nice a presentation as with the others because we just analyzed this data really recently. So, so you can see here what happens is that, so in the HRS, and this is the respondents' education polygenic score here, you can see that in the HRS there is an association with leaving an inheritance. And so these are actually adjusted for a number of variables, including assets. And also number of children and a bunch of others that you can see here. So we find that in the HRS there is an association. So parents with high education polygenic scores were indicated a higher chance of leaving an inheritance. And then in the WLS there was no significant effect there, or no effect whatsoever, whether significant or not. It was just very small. And then we have the financial support. So this was just a yes or no question. So I'm showing you relative risks here. And this was very consistent across the two cohorts, so that respondents with higher education polygenic scores were more likely to say that they provided financial support to their adult children. And then we find something quite similar for help with childcare, where again, it was the same in the two cohorts, so that parents with higher education polygenic scores were more likely to say that they had provided help with childcare to their offspring. And then, so briefly about the child effects, and this is about the question as well that Jason asked earlier. So, I mean, you're all familiar what child effects are, but I thought it would be nice to show you an example of a research design that I think is really nice to show child effects. So this is an adoption study by Gordon Harold et al., published in 2013. And so the adoption design is really nice for studying child effects, because you can look at, if you have data on the biological parent, you can see whether the biological parent, in this case ADHD symptoms, are associated with the rearing parent, so the adoptive parent, reaction to the child. And under a couple of assumptions, such as non-selective placement and the biological mother and the rearing mother having never met, this is a really strong design to show child effects, because that would be, so it would be the only reason why these would be associated to biological mother and rearing mother behaviors would be because of the child. So that is sort of the link between the two. And this is what the study showed as well. So that there was an association between biological mother ADHD symptoms and rearing mother, in this case, hostility to the child. And so that was mediated by children's impulsivity and activation in this study. So basically children's ADHD symptoms. So this is pretty strong evidence that there's a child effect on rearing mother's hostility here. I'm just going to close my blind a little bit more, because it's just, okay. And so this is what we found in our data. And so this is just the parental behaviors during childhood. So this is cognitively stimulating parenting, household chaos, and health parenting. And so what you can see here is the unique, so just the simple association between mother's polygenic score and the outcome, that's in orange. And then here in turquoise, you can see just the simple unadjusted association of the child polygenic score with the outcome, so with the parenting outcome. And then you can see here in the orange stripy bars, what is the unique effect of the moms and what is the unique effect of the child, so adjusted for each other, so both in the same model, basically. And you can see here pretty consistently that the stripy bars, that it goes down. So that makes sense. These are mothers and child polygenic scores, obviously highly correlated, and both are uniquely associated with parenting. And it's interesting, I thought, that in ERISC, we find that the unique effect of the child, so what we could think of as the child effect, reduces by quite a bit more, and actually becomes non-significant here as well, and is approximately half of that of the mother's effect. Whereas in ALSBAG, you can see that they're actually staying quite high, and basically almost as high as the mother's effect. Now, and actually, I'm referencing here Asta Breinholt and Dalton Conley's recent paper, where they also looked at child effects on cognitively stimulating parenting in ALSBAG, and find something very similar. So because it is the same data. So again, find child effects on cognitively stimulating parenting. Now, what's important to bear in mind here is that it's not all that clear what the child polygenic score captures here, because we're missing one family member, we're missing the fathers. And so what looks like a child effect could actually be reflecting father's genetics. And so in this paper by Breinholt and Conley, they adjusted for fathers in the subsample of 2,000 or so trios, and they found that there were still child effects on cognitively stimulating parenting. But we haven't done this yet for household chaos and health parenting, so we don't know what it looks like there. And as far as I remember, when adjusting for fathers in this cognitively stimulating parenting association, that child effect reduced by a bit, suggesting that it partly does capture genetics of the fathers here. So that's something to bear in mind, that, you know, when wanting to demonstrate child effects, it's important to include the fathers there. But this suggests that there might be effects of the children. And it might seem weird, especially for something like health parenting, but the one thing that we see in developmental psychology is that children shape almost everything their parents do. So even measures where you traditionally think of as really only parent-driven. So the health parenting, for example, remember it includes the TV watching of the child. And we find actually that even though parents think that, and many researchers think that parents can just make rules about how much TV the child watches and the child will follow these rules, it is actually in studies that just look at this phenotypically, we find that children's behaviors are predicting the amount of TV that they watch, not only the other way around. So, and also what they eat. And I have a toddler at home, and I can tell you that, you know, I can try very hard to make her eat healthy, but it's not always easy. So you know, so it's not impossible that there are child effects on these things.
Yes, I have one question about e-risk. So they're all twins, like each family is a mother and two children. And is it both MZ and TZ?
That's right. Yeah, actually, yeah.
So how are you doing this? Is it per dyad here, or is it?
That's a really good question. So actually the perfect design to look at child effects would be to just compare, so use a within twin design, right? So look at whether the child with a higher education polygenic score evokes different parenting from their parent. And unfortunately, we can't do that in e-risk because this has been assessed on a family level. So yeah, thanks for reminding me of this point, because that I had this later in my discussion slides, but it is, you know, people know that there are child effects on parenting and that parenting differs for children in a family. And yet when you look at assessments of parenting, so often it is on a family level rather than for each child and a family individually. And it's a real shame, because it would be so interesting to look at this. So I have not found any study that looks at, for example, health parenting on a individual child level. So so some of these could be done because, for example, the amount of the TV that the child watches in Alsbach, there are interviews with the mothers about siblings in the family. And so the mothers are asked, how much TV does this child watch? How much TV does this other child watch? And so that could be done. And so that would be really interesting. And we haven't done that yet, but basically
one implication, I was just puzzled by the child unique on the e-risk being smaller in general than Alsbach.
Right.
And I think you just answered part of it, which is in some sense the measurement of parenting is clouded because you don't know which child we're talking about.
Exactly.
So that's part of it. That's interesting. But just, parenting twins must be a little different anyway. And you have all twins on the right-hand side of the figure. So that's useful. Thank you for that. And I think Q has a question.
Yep.
Yes, just a follow-up on this slide. So because the phenotype here is parental behavior, right? So I think naturally we would expect to see a stronger effect size, a stronger association between parental polygenic score and these traits. And in e-risk, we do see that, but in Alsbach, it looks like the effect size is almost identical. I wonder if you can comment on this and maybe say something about is there any specific difference between the two studies that might actually explain this pattern?
I have to say, so far, so we got this, so I looked at this last week, so I haven't had that much time yet to think about it, but I did find it very surprising as well. So what I would have expected is things to look more like e-risk, especially for household chaos and for health parenting, for example. Because even though the child, as I just explained, might have an effect on these things, so it's reasonable to think that there might be some effect. I wouldn't have thought that for health parenting, for example, that the effect is even, is still so high in Alsbach. And yeah, I'm generally a little puzzled. So one thing I considered, so I wondered, so, you know, what I find tricky with this model of just adjusting for the other family members' polygenic score is that the different generations might just not be comparable in their associations with the outcome, you know. So you're not actually effectively adjusting for everything in the parent, and so that is something that I wondered, and so I'd be curious to see if we actually use the trios, what happens then. So because I think that provides a better so here we're basically just relying on the assumption that the polygenic score in the parent generation and in the child generation is exactly comparable. But if, for example, the error is higher in one of them, then it's not as good an adjustment. Does that make sense? So I wonder if that could play into it in some way. But then it's weird that we wouldn't have that in ERIS, because, you know, they actually, ERIS and Alsbach are extremely comparable in terms of the age and the birth year of the parent and a lot of factors. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on here is the short answer.
Thank you. And just a very quick follow-up. So in general, if we observe a very strong association between child genetics and parental behavior, doesn't have to be parenting, but just parental behavior in general, I can think of two mechanisms. Right? First, it's just the child genetics correlated with parental genetics, right? So partially the association reflects that. And another could be the genetic nurture effect from child genetics directly to parental behavior. Is there another interpretation for this? What could be other mechanisms that give you this sort of intergenerational correlation?
You mean the intergenerational correlation between
For example, I guess to be more specific, we are seeing that in Alsbach, the child genetics is more strongly associated with parental behavior compared to ERIS, right? I wonder, should we interpret this as, for example, stronger indirect genetic effect from child to parent, or could there be some other confounding or population stratification, that sort of artifact that can potentially explain this? That's why I was wondering if there's another interpretation for this type of intergenerational correlation.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure is the short answer. We are adjusting for population stratification in the same way in both studies. So I don't think it would necessarily explain the difference, especially because these studies are so comparable in all other ways. Yeah, do you think, are you thinking of anything in particular, or, I mean,
not at all. You're the expert here. I'm just intrigued by the data you presented. Yeah.
Like I said, so the only thing that I think is important here is that it is very difficult to interpret the child net of the mother if we haven't included the fathers here. So that is the one thing that I will say. And it will be good to see what happens when we include the fathers, because that is just really the difficulty here. But other than that, I can't think of any ready explanations for the difference in Alsbach and ERIS here. There is another raised hand by James. Yeah.
Hi. So feel free to answer this question later if you intend to, but I can't help but think, especially with a data set like Alsbach, one of the first things I think about is the fact that it's a prospective longitudinal study for which there are, I don't even know how many data points they've collected at this point. So my question has to do with the fact that the measures that you use to assess these different domains of parenting, I would wager that they probably measured them many times. And so doesn't that also factor into these associations possibly being reflective of at what point in time are we looking at these types of constructs? So is it early life? Is it childhood? Is it adolescence? Because I think they might have measured it over time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's interesting. We haven't actually looked at it at the different time points. So at the moment, what I showed you is basically aggregate measures across the time points. I mean, we do that in a similar way in ERIS and in Alsbach. So, but Alsbach has more measures across time because they have more waves. So Alsbach would allow us to look, we would have more opportunities here to look at different age phases. And that is interesting because especially thinking about the health parenting, that it has been measured at many more time points in Alsbach compared to e-risk. So that's an interesting idea, yeah. And that is something that we could look at. So we could just pick out the time point in Alsbach that is most comparable to e-risk and then compare it and see if that makes a difference, and also see whether, because you'd think that maybe an older child could have maybe more of an effect on the parent or something like that. There might be reasons for differences across ages. So that's interesting.
I mean, I just wanted to say, I think that these genetic association findings might be reflective of something developmental, right? Like, I think earlier you had talked about how parenting matters at different time points. Like, the impact of parenting matters more earlier than it does later. And so with Alsbach, you have this very wide range of age ranges in which they've measured parenting, which is one of the strengths of Alsbach. So I wonder, by just aggregating it all, you might just be losing a lot of the very developmentally sensitive associations that you could identify. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to do later on.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And we could definitely do some more there. And it is interesting because the slides that I showed you early on with those different developmental phases, where we have childhood as one developmental phase, but that's obviously huge, from 1 to 11 years, it's a really long time period. So splitting that up more and looking at it at different ages within that would be really interesting. Yeah, no, thanks. That's a really great point. And maybe we can talk about this a little more later as well. Yep. No, that's very interesting. Yeah. Okay. So now that I was talking a little bit about the fathers, I will actually use that as a transition to talk a bit more about fathers. And so there has been an increasing interest in the role of fathers for children's development. And partly this might be due to the figure that I'm showing you here on this slide. So fathers spend a lot more time with their children today than they did 30, 40 years ago. So on this slide, you can see for different countries, the amount of time in minutes that fathers spend with their children per day. This is separately plotted for university educated and non-university educated fathers. And it includes activities such as washing, feeding, or preparing food. So things that you could classify maybe as more of a role of fathers in housework more generally. But it also includes things such as supervising and playing with children. And you can see here that across these countries, that red line and both the solid line and the dotted line are going up. So that fathers spend a lot more time with children in these activities. And so this is part of the reason why people are wondering, does this increasing involvement, what are actually the outcome, what are the consequences of this for children, and what are the consequences of fathers parenting for children's outcomes? Now, the issue with fathers is that they have also become more difficult to study over that period. So I'm showing you here over a similar time period, the share of households that are single parent. And when I say single parent, it's most often mothers who are heading these households. And you don't have to look at each of these lines individually, but you can just see the trend across the countries, which is that there's an increasing share of households that are headed by a single parent, most often a single mother. And that just makes it, logistically, it just means that it is a lot harder to track fathers down and include them in research unless you make really dedicated and quite costly efforts to do that, for example, in the Fragile Families study. So that is just a complication here. And there has been some work, so this is from ages ago, but we see a very similar pattern in more recent papers as well, that there's a self-selection in who of these fathers participates in research. So that the fathers who are included in research studies, they are better educated, they have different attitudes to parenting. For example, they're less authoritarian, so they differ on a range of variables. And we find in Alsbach that there's also a selection effect in terms of polygenic scores. And so in Alsbach, we haven't yet looked at the father's polygenic scores yet, but we have got the mother's polygenic scores. And so we looked at this, and we found that, so the mothers were asked whether the child lives with their biological dad at different ages. And then I show you here the difference in polygenic score, in mother's education polygenic score, between those who said that the child lives with their biological dad or not. And you can see here that the difference, so the tendency here is that mothers who say that the child does not live with their biological dad have lower education polygenic scores. So this would suggest, if that would be replicated for the fathers, that would suggest that there is a sort of a selection effect who stays in these studies on a genetic level as well. And then here on the right, you can see that there's also an association. So this is about the year when the father left. And you can see that there's a small positive association, so that in families where the mother has a higher education polygenic score, the father is, so I don't want to say the father leaves at a later age, because it implies that there's that he kind of abandons the family. But whatever happens here on the family level, it means that these mothers are less likely to live with their children's biological father. And that makes sense, because as children grow older, things such as divorce or separation, anything where the father is no longer living with the family, is becoming more normative. So that would explain why this seems to go down over time. But yeah, so that is basically something that needs to be kept in mind when looking at, these trio designs as well, so that we have the representation of fathers that we have in these studies might be quite selected. And then I already mentioned to you that in Alsbach, we have an N of fathers of around 2,000, which is about half the size of the mothers and children, mother-child dyads that we have. So it reduces by quite a lot there as well. Now, an alternative design is to follow men into parenthood. So what we have in the Dunedin study, so that's a pre-existing cohort study. So the Dunedin participants were recruited into the study from when they were born, and then they have been followed up across the ages. And then when they were young adults, some of them started to have kids, and that was when a second study was initiated that followed the main Dunedin study participants into parenthood. And so this is a nice way, because these people are already in the study, these fathers are already in the study, and they have, in the case of Dunedin, they're very closely connected to the study. And so this was a strategy to get a wider representation of fathers that might otherwise not necessarily be included in studies. So fathers with lower education, fathers who do not permanently live with their kids. And so in these fathers, we had a look at just the very first step of looking at fathers in more detail, which is associations between fathers' education polygenic scores and their parenting. And this is so because we had either the father or the mother, we did not adjust for the other parent. So that is something to keep in mind, because there's a sort of mating likely going on. And so what might look like an effect of the father's polygenic score could be confounded by mother's polygenic score. So in the future, we would want to adjust for the other parent, which we can do in the studies where we have data from both parents. But just to give you just a first stab at this, you can see here these associations are fairly similar. I mean, it really sort of depends on your prior year, what you would have expected. But I think that to me they look pretty similar in terms of the association between the parent polygenic scores with the two parent outcomes that we measured in Dunedin, which are cognitive stimulation and warm sensitive parenting. All right, so now moving into the discussion, and basically I'm just listing a few things here, and then we can just like talk about them. So it's I'm just going to summarize a little bit, and and then we can take that as a starting point to discuss. So basically what we saw here were pretty pervasive associations between parental genetics and all kinds of parental behaviors that for many of them we know are important for child development and child outcomes. And these are environments that are important for many outcomes, not just educational attainment. So for example, health parenting is important for BMI. And this might explain as well why there are genetic nurture effects from parental education to offspring outcomes other than education, for example, health. Now, a caveat of this is that all of these associations were pretty small. So, you know, that I think is just important to emphasize here. I'm not going to pretend that, you know, these are like massive associations because they're all very modest and small. And especially once you make some of these adjustments that I think are important, for example, for child polygenic score, we're really looking at very small links here. And so one interpretation that we had here is that, sorry, it just keeps going back. I'm sorry, just trying to, yeah, here we go. So there is this possibility of the perpetuation of inequalities by parental education through these genetic effects on parental behaviors and environments. And this doesn't seem to be something that is only limited to one specific period of the child's life, but is something that is very consistent from when a child is conceived to when the child is an adult and receives an inheritance. So really across the entire life here, we see the same pattern of parents who have the higher education polygenic scores, so are already sort of privileged in that sense, creating these more privileged environments for their kids as well. And likewise, kids who will inherit higher education polygenic scores from their parents are also being provided with these advantageous environments. And so that also has the prospect of potentially widening inequalities because those who already have, basically there's a concentration of advantages here. Yeah, so that is one way to make sense of it or to put it into a broader context. And one thing that I think is important here is that we have not considered the role of policies or the broader economic context here. So there's two ways in which this is relevant. So when you think back to that slide that I showed you that lists the data set that we have, you might remember that all of these data sets come from countries that have pretty high levels of inequality. So the UK and the US and actually even New Zealand is more unequal than you might expect. Because I think, you know, New Zealand always has this, it seems like such a haven, but it actually has, I don't know the Gini coefficient by heart now, but it is pretty high as well. So these are all countries where there's a high level of inequality. And that might have implications for associations with parenting. So there's this interesting work that the greater a country's inequality, the more parents push their kids and the more parents invest in their children. And so, you know, I'd be really curious to see what happens if we would look at any of this in countries that are more egalitarian, like Denmark or Sweden, for example. And then the other way that policies might play into this is that these countries that I showed you leave a lot of power in the hands of parents. So in the absence of, for example, widely available educational supports for young kids, and in the absence of strict tax laws, for example, about inheritances, these effects might have more room to come out because parents know that they need to do these things to promote their children's outcomes. And so, yeah, again, another reason why I think it would be interesting to look at this in other contexts. Yeah, this is really, some of you might be familiar with this work by Döpke and Silibotti. And yeah, I would recommend this. This is an article from the Washington Post, but they also wrote a book on economics and parenting, and it's a great read. And then, so for the child effects, we talked about most of this already. So there's this potential role of children in shaping environments. We know this from phenotypic studies, and it seems to be borne out here in the genetic data as well. But it is important to conduct additional analysis here to figure out exactly what's going on. So we would need to control for father's genetics, and we would also ideally, what we said previously, the ideal design really is a sibling design, but it's tricky when parenting is measured at the household level. So that makes it more difficult to track these effects. And then finally, so for the fathers, so just the first step of this, just looking at whether there are differences in associations between parents' genetics and parenting, we find that there weren't really. But as I already said, there are additional analysis that we need there as well to look at this in more detail. So we would want to look at the unique effects of each parent and take into account sortative mating. And yeah, again, I think the trio design would be a helpful answer to some of these questions. Yeah. And then just a big acknowledgement to the teams that I work with on this at Duke and also at King's College London, where ERISC is based, and then the collaborators who have done a lot of these analysis for the other studies, particularly the HRS and the WLS, and the Quebec twin study as well. And thank you, of course, for listening and already contributing a lot of your thoughts. I'm very grateful for that. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great, let's open it up for questions. You can either chime in or raise your hand to get in the queue.
So maybe I can go first. So if you were to run a GWAS on parenting behavior, how would you define the phenotype? And why hasn't anyone done this?
That's a good question. I have been thinking about that. Yeah, I think the reason why no one has done this yet is because it's just, yeah, because what you just said, it's really hard to define the phenotype here. I think you could pick a phenotype. I mean, you could pick something like cognitively stimulating parenting. You know, you could pick something like actually like breastfeeding or something like that. But I mean, the numbers would be so small. I think it would be impossible to get large enough numbers here to get anything that will give you enough power. I mean, when you looked at the table, just the cohorts that we have so far that have data on childhood, that adds up to maybe something like 25,000 or so. Developmental psychology just has a lot of very small studies. So I think it would be really difficult to get the numbers together, basically.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And you actually mentioned breastfeeding, but in UK Biobank, there actually is a GWAS on breastfeeding, but it's by definition multi-generational because the participants of UK Biobank were asked, were they breastfed as an infant? But that GWAS actually exists and the sample size is huge. I wonder if that can provide some insight.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, so we haven't included that because we wanted to look at parenting from the perspective of the parent, but that is really interesting that you would have. Yeah, I'd be curious. It's kind of a little. Yeah, I would like to look at this in more detail because it's kind of tricky to ask people whether they were breastfed as kids. I mean, I guess you could just have like a blunt measure of were you breastfed or not. So that would still, I mean, I think it would be a start, yeah, for sure. And then combining that with these other cohorts. Yeah, I'll have to put more thoughts into this, but that's interesting that that's an interesting thought, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Sam, I think is up there, yeah.
Great. Thanks for the talk. It was, yeah, really interesting. And yeah, I think just assembling all of these different data sets that kind of have aligned measures is like a super fruitful endeavor. I was curious, like, what do you make of, well, so kind of the approaches that you've presented and, you know, even some of the research I've done on this, when you use polygenic scores to sort of look at the, you know, indirect genetic effects, the genetic nurture effects, you sort of use the education polygenic score. So you're only going to sort of look at the mechanisms basically that are captured by sort of the genetic influences on education. And I was kind of curious, like, what do you make of, so some of these recent studies, I think, by Alexander Young and co-authors have showed that the correlation between the sort of the SNP level effects of the sort of direct genetic effects and then the genetic nurture effects are kind of lower than you'd expect. I think with education it was like 0.45 or something like that. And so my one question is, like, what do you make of that? And sort of how could we try to sort of study the similar questions that you're asking, but can tap into that other 0.55 bit, the sort of the piece of the indirect genetic effects, the genetic nurture effects that are not sort of operating through this sort of the contagion, the same genes affecting your own genotype and the genotype of your children.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether an approach like genomic SEM could be used for that. I'd be curious to hear Michelle's or Elliot's take on this, because I guess that would be one way to sort of not just include education, because I agree with what you said. I mean, it is kind of, I think there are good reasons for focusing on education, but at the same time, it is sort of a little bit dissatisfying to only restrict yourself to education, So yes, I wonder whether that could be an approach to integrate genetics associated with other outcomes as well. And then I think there was an interesting paper, and I think you had a present to you as well, Rosa Cheeseman, who, so I haven't actually, so I think her paper, the paper that I think she presented to you as well, was a really interesting attempt to look at this more broadly. And yeah, I haven't looked at it in an awful lot of detail, but just based on reading through that and hearing her talk about it, I thought that was like a really interesting and promising approach. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Kind of she uses, I guess, that RDR method, but yeah, because she's sort of working with molecular genetic data, she's able to kind of get the heritability that's not just sort of mediated through the phenotype. But yeah, no, it's super. Yeah. That's a really good.
So I think that I mean, I really enjoyed that paper, and I think that could be really cool. Yeah, working sort of within that framework and try to move from there. So yeah.
Totally. And one thing that we'll learn, when you ask Alexander Young about, what do you make of this correlation being so low? So like the fact that, the parental effects are sort of, correlated not so strongly with the, direct effects. And what he says, and it's just speculative, but he thinks so, in using kind of when you control for the parental genotype, then sort of the child genotype is randomly assigned. So there's no kind of stratification in that. There's no bias in that effect, but the parental genotype is still kind of potentially confounded by, population structure, sort of making all of these different things.
Yeah.
And so, his take basically is that it's not even, it's not necessarily that the sort of the genes are really different that sort of shape my education and my kids' education, but that actually it's just sort of a signal that, the parental effects have a lot of stratification in them still. So that's sort of, hopefully in the coming years as we get new methods.
Yeah, like it would be interesting what would be cool is if you had like a twin sample as parents, and then you could look at, you could basically look at whether the twin with the higher education polygenic score differs in their parenting. So that could be cool. So taking that sibling design approach on into the parent level, but it's just really difficult. I mean, now with increasing numbers of samples being genotyped, there are samples of adult twins where there is some data available on their parenting. There was actually a great meta-analysis a while ago that looked at gene environment correlation, both from the perspective of the parent and from the perspective of the child, and it used twin samples. And so there are a bunch of twin samples where the parents are twins, and so that could be something, or children's of twin data, which in fact MOBA has, so the Big Norway study. So maybe that would be a way to get at this question of stratification a bit more, because then you have the same advantages that you have when you look at when you just look at children's polygenic source and their educational attainment within twins, for example. So that could be cool.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I think that's a great way to think about it. It's such in some ways, the genetic nurture effects are harder to study because you need, like, if you want to use sort of you know, you need siblings that are parents, and then also you want to be able to have genotype kids to control for the direct effects, and you just need more data than you need, I think, for some
that's why I'm really pleased to see this interest in family data in genetics, you know, where I feel it was only quite recently that people thought, oh, it's really helpful to look at this in twins, because then we can rule out some the population stratification, and then from there, and then we can rule out we are better at ruling out genetic nurture effects. And so this interest that I feel is coming from many different sides of looking at family data, and not just, you know, like one mother and two kids or a trio, but also more generations, basically. So yeah, I think that's really cool, and it's kind of nice to see, because, you know, I'm interested in families, and then seeing an interest in families coming from that end, it's just sort of like rewarding to see. Yeah, it's nice. Families are great to study and important, and tell you so much about these processes. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question, Jasmine. Yasmin. Yeah, that was super interesting. And I agree with Sam too, how you're assembling all these data sets is super fascinating. And I guess I wanted to go back to a point that you said in your talk too, where thinking about kind of the welfare system in countries, how equitable countries are. So you're mostly looking at countries that are in the UK and the US, right?
That's right, yeah. So we basically have the UK, the US, and then we have that small New Zealand sample, and we have a small Canadian sample.
Okay. Yeah, because it would be interesting to see if we see these same associations in countries where there is a more equitable distribution of resources, because I feel like that would kind of maybe get at this question of, is this just reflecting the fact that parents with more education have access to more resources, and so they can be better parents, versus there's something genetic going on here, you know? Right. I mean, and I think, especially for policy, I think that would be interesting, because, you know, the intervention we would think would be to, you know, increase access to education if we think that's a mechanism for parenting and for better parenting. And so, yeah, I think that could be an interesting way at maybe getting at that question, is looking at whether we see these same kind of slopes or, you know, associations in countries that have a more equitable welfare state. Yeah, I don't know if you have any comments on that, or if you've seen anyone who's done something like that, or yeah, and in Denmark. And I mean, also when you showed that graph of Denmark with the fathers and the mothers, the whole curve, you know, was just completely different.
Yeah.
And I have, you know, so yeah, if you've thought more about looking into that and what you think about that, the associations and the intervention here, what is the intervention?
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that would be really interesting. And it's actually something that, I mean, we had this, so we are in contact with the MOBA people, people working with the MOBA data. But I mean, Norway is great, but actually, I think Denmark or Sweden would be even better. So, I think Norway is actually not as equal as like I feel like people just think of those countries, but you know, like I think Norway is actually a country that is still fairly unequal, and but even that would be interesting though, because I think attitudes to parenting differ as well. So regardless of inequality, like I think it's just interesting to look at this in countries that are not the UK and the US, because just the way that that parents think of themselves and their role in their children's development differs in countries over and above their different inequality levels. So it would be really, really nice to include different countries. And unfortunately, apart from MOBA, we haven't yet identified other data that could fit in here that would have been as readily available as the data that we have now. But I agree that it would be really interesting. And and the more I look at these results, the more I think that, you know, that would really be a good comparison. I think in terms of the implications, so when we looked at this first just in ERISC and in Dunedin, the conclusion that we drew in our paper, particularly when we published this in ERISC, was that so, you know, I find it always so difficult to draw any policy implications from this because the effects are so small, you know, they're confounded potentially. And so yeah, I'm really hesitant there. But at the same time, I think if you wanted to draw a conclusion from there, I think it would be about wider availability of these advantageous environments so that it doesn't depend on the parents so much whether the child has access to them, you know? So whether that's you know, healthy food in schools and preschool, affordable preschool, parental leave, you know, like all of these kinds of policies that we know are good for families, but that unfortunately are very slowly, if at all, implemented in countries like the US, and also the UK is not always great on many of these. So yeah, so that would be my takeaway from that.
Yeah,
thanks
you.
everyone for all the questions and for a great discussion. Jasmin, thanks for the presentation. I know we'll have some individual meetings later, so thanks again for sharing your work.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and for listening. Great.